Welcome back, everyone. Today, we are going to understand why 99.7% of Mongolia is completely empty. Mongolia is an interesting country that's another blind spot of mine when it comes to really why it's so renowned today. It just goes, you cannot look at it without looking through the lens of the Mongolian Empire, the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, the 11th century, the 12th century, somewhere around there. So I think we're going to dissect this video really from the core of what it's about, but also to see how, history has played a part for the entire Mongolian culture. So let's jump right into it and let's go. Let's learn.
Mongolia is perhaps the most fascinating country in the modern world. First of all, it's huge. It's more than twice the size of Texas, and if you placed it over the...
That's insane. Twice the size of Texas. And the whole video is about why most of it's empty. When we say empty, I'm guessing sparse of population, rural?
United States, it would basically cover the entire historical south of the country, spanning from Philadelphia in the east to Dallas in the west. But trapped in the middle of the Eurasian continent, Mongolia is surrounded on all of its sides by hundreds of kilometers of land separating it from the ocean, making it the largest landlocked country in the world that doesn't have access to an internal sea.
And that not having access to the sea, being landlocked, just puts you at such a disadvantage for the the economic side, military side. I would be surprised if Mongolia has much of a standing army.
In theory, Kazakhstan is substantially larger than Mongolia and technically also classified as landlocked, but Kazakhstan also enjoys a nearly 1,900-kilometer-long coastline with the internal Caspian Sea.
So they have fisheries,
across which it can conduct maritime trade with Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and Turkmenistan. Mongolia, on the other hand, possesses no such direct access to any large bodies of water. And partially because of that and a whole bunch of other factors, Mongolia is quite literally the emptiest country on the planet. You see, Mongolia has more than 1.5 million square kilometers worth of land, which makes it the 18th largest country in the world in terms of overall area. But Mongolia also has a pretty tiny population of just around 3.3 million people.
Now that's not tiny, but relatively.
Who live across all of that land, which is basically just the same amount of people as live around San Diego in California. Because of this, Mongolia's average population density is just at around 2.1 people per square kilometer.
So what's that ranked in the world? Probably in the hundreds?
Of land, which is by far the absolute lowest of any sovereign country in the world.
Okay, never mind.
For reference, that density of people across Mongolia is roughly a third lower than the countries who have the second and third lowest population densities in the world. Australia and Namibia, both of which have large amounts of their territories covered with vast, uninhabitable deserts. But Mongolia is somehow even emptier than all of this at first suggests. Australia has multiple large population centers with 5 cities scattered around the country that have more than 1 million residents apiece.
I'm guessing Mongolia only has the capital.
Meaning that the distribution of people around Australia is far more evenly distributed than it is in Mongolia, because despite how it appears, Mongolia is basically just one giant city-state with a ton of empty land around it that is cosplaying as the world's 18th biggest country. The capital and the largest
by territory, by natural resources, yeah.
City in Mongolia is here, Ulaanbaatar, and it's
Ulaanbaatar.
Home to about 1.6
That's about half.
million people, which makes it actually a really big city. Ulaanbaatar is the core of the modern Mongolian state, and its population places it on a par with Barcelona in Spain for a similar number of people. But the fact that this big of a city exists within Mongolia means that Ulaanbaatar alone is home to roughly 48% of the entire Mongolian population. This makes Mongolia one of the most highly centralized countries in the entire world.
It's pretty cool though. It's like a San Marino or a what do you call it? A Monaco, but vastly rich in resources. What kind of resources do they have though? Do they have really interesting natural resources that fuel their GDP?
And because Ulaanbaatar only takes up 0.3% of Mongolia's land,
It's a shipyard converted into a market. Pretty interesting.
It means that you've got a situation in the country where 48% of the population, or 1.6 million people, all live on just 0.3% of the land, while the other 52% of the population, or 1.7 million people, all live across the remaining 99.7% of the land. This means that Ulaanbaatar's massively concentrated population greatly skews the average population density across the whole country. And so, when you exclude the city's land from the calculation, the remaining 99.7% of Mongolia contains an average population density of just 1.1 people per square kilometer, which is about 3 times emptier than Australia or Namibia both are on average. To put that figure into further perspective,
I don't like these hypotheticals, as you can tell.
99.7% of Mongolia's land is nearly half as densely populated with people as the far northern region of Finland.
And even worse, there are more penguins per square kilometer in Antarctica.
Called Lapland that stretches well above the Arctic Circle and is the least densely populated part of the European Union. It is across this vast, empty stretch of Mongolia where roughly 1/3 of the
Mongolia is not even part of the EU.
population continues to this day in the 21st century to live a nomadic herding lifestyle that would, in many ways, remain familiar to the era
Nomadic?
of Genghis Khan more than 800 years ago. So how did this situation in Mongolia develop and persist well into the 21st century? What is it about this country that has made it the emptiest in the entire world? To begin the explanation, you need to understand some things about Mongolia's geography and climate. You see, the country's territory exists across most of the High Mongolian Plateau, a region of high elevation across Central Asia that is contained on all of its sides by even higher mountain ranges. The elevation across the Mongolian Plateau ranges from 1,000 to 1,500 meters above sea level, and Mongolia's borders within the high plateau
Where is Ulaanbaatar in all this? Is it like in a valley?
place it nearly 800 kilometers away from the nearest oceanic body of water, the Yellow Sea. So, because of the Mongolian Plateau's high elevation and distance away from the Indo-Pacific, deep within the Eurasian continental interior, moist monsoon winds that bring rainfall from the Pacific
It's very dry.
rarely, if ever, are able to carry all of their moisture all the way into the Mongolian Plateau. And then to the north, the Mongolian Plateau also sits immediately beneath Siberia, which dramatically influences its climate and ability to
It was dry and cold like a taiga.
contain people. Beginning around every August, the days in northern Asia steadily begin growing shorter and shorter as winter approaches, which causes the cold and dry air blowing into Siberia from the frozen Arctic Ocean to begin growing even colder. The air that then collects over Siberia then grows even colder than the air over the Arctic Ocean, because the air over the Arctic generally forms over sea ice that radiates heat better than the cold tundra environment of Siberia does. Generally, from September to April then every single year, this collection of very cold and dry Siberian air and high atmospheric pressure gets transferred across northern Eurasia, and particularly
That's an very, I would say interesting, but I also would say that's a very detrimental combination.
gets pushed into the Mongolian Plateau, which means that winters in Mongolia are nearly always very cold and very dry. The cold, dry, and shallow air from Siberia plunges into the Mongolian Plateau's lower elevated river valleys and basins and then lingers there, generating brutally cold temperatures across the north of Mongolia that generally gets less severe the further south in the country you go. The
Like you could show me this and you could say, what do you think this is? And I'm probably gonna say Greenland or Antarctica.
median temperature across the country in January is negative 30 degrees Celsius.
Maybe
But that fact
Finland.
obscures the reality that freak cold snaps and blizzards can rapidly and unexpectedly happen pretty much anywhere in Mongolia during the long winter season. And temperatures can quickly shift on the order of 30 degrees Celsius in a matter of only 24 hours.
Well, I mean, 30 degrees Celsius. That's good weather.
Regional lows of down to negative 40 degrees Celsius are common across the north of the country during the winter. All of Mongolia's rivers and lakes will freeze over during the brutal winters because of this phenomenon, and many of the smaller rivers will freeze solid down to their bottom, which makes Mongolia's rivers and lakes not very useful for
Maybe that's why the Khans tried to conquest everywhere because they wanted to get to a better environment.
Transportation or irrigation throughout most of the year. Ulaanbaatar, the capital and the largest city, is only free of frost for around 3.5 months of the year between the middle of May and the end of August. And the city's average annual temperature is just negative 2.9 degrees Celsius, or about 27 degrees Fahrenheit, which makes Ulaanbaatar the coldest capital city on the planet. But that fact hides the reality that during the short Mongol summers,
you wouldn't expect that. Like, I would not expect Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, to have the coolest. I would think, like I was thinking before, like Finland or Iceland.
temperatures can also soar into unbelievable highs of up to 38 degrees Celsius or 100 Fahrenheit in the southernmost regions of the country, and even 33 degrees Celsius or 91 Fahrenheit in the capital. Then, accompanying these temperature extremes during very long, cold winters and very short, hot summers is the further fact that Mongolia receives.
So this is like the most bipolar country there can be, I guess, with weather. Maybe there's a one that's worse than that. Very bipolar.
Receives very, very little rainfall. The highly elevated Mongolian plateau is surrounded by even higher mountains that block most rainfall from entering into it from nearly every direction.
China.
To the south, the towering Himalayas and the Kunlun Shan mountains block rain coming in from that direction. To the west, the Altai mountains do the same, in addition to the Mongol Altai and Gobi Altai sub-ranges further to the south. Moisture-rich winds blowing in from these directions pass over those mountains first and mostly deposit their moisture as snowfall on the sides of those mountains facing away from Mongolia. Then, the winds are mostly dry by the time they blow over the Mongolian plateau. And throughout the whole winter between September and April, the dry and cold and high-pressure air that blows into and then sits over the Mongolian plateau from Siberia forces away any low-pressure, moist, and potentially rainy air, which keeps the skies clear and cloud-free throughout the whole season. This is why Mongolia is actually one of the sunniest countries in the world. It averages around 257 very sunny and
Because not a lot of rainfall.
cloud-free days a year, lending the country its nickname as the land of the eternal blue sky. But it also means that throughout the long winter between September and April, it hardly rains anywhere in Mongolia at all, and whatever precipitation they do get is usually just snow or frost that blows down with the winds from Siberia. Then, during the summer between May and August, when the high-pressure, cold and dry system from Siberia weakens and retreats, some amount of rainy air is finally able to penetrate into the Mongolian plateau from the north. This is why rainfall levels in northern Mongolia are, on average, much higher than in southern Mongolia. But it's important to understand that nearly all of northern Mongolia's rainfall just comes over a few months when the Siberian high-pressure system is at its weakest, between June and August. Outside of the summer months, northern Mongolia receives hardly any rain at all and is basically just as arid as the rest of the country. And then, even during the summer months, rainfall is often unpredictable.
You know, I just keep thinking, like, all the people that do not live in Ulaanbaatar, everyone that lives more or less in the rural areas, how do they get by with this type of rainfall? Usually you would have to have, you know, some sort of robust farming to survive in these climates, especially if you're so disconnected and spread out. The probably no electric grid that goes across. I'll have to rely. Maybe you can rely on Starlink today, but so weird and so different. Like, is farming applicable? Is it like where, like you said, the 3 months of the year that you have a decent time of weather? Is that your farming period where you have to like get enough food for the winter? Is it like that?
Predictable and difficult to count on. This effect has also contributed to the existence of the vast Gobi Desert across the southeast of the Mongolian plateau, the 6th largest desert in the world, which is extremely cold and arid, and where parts of it will receive no rainfall at all for years at a time. Overall, Mongolia has a very cold, dry, and windy climate. The southernmost third of the country is mostly a cold, arid desert, while the rest is mostly cold, arid steppe covered in seemingly endless grasslands with limited forest coverage in the north. Because of all these factors, only about 0.4%
Like Mars.
of Mongolia's vast amount of land is even considered arable and suitable for crop cultivation and agriculture.
I was about to say.
Excluding tiny Pacific Island states and city-states, there were only 3 other countries in the world who have a lower percentage of
I would say Libya, Algeria, Oman, something like that.
arable land than Mongolia does: Djibouti, Iceland, and Oman. This also means that despite being the 18th largest country in the world by overall amount of land, Mongolia also has less available arable land than Albania has got, a country that is more than 54 times smaller in overall area. That simply means that
I mean, you're not comparing apples to apples.
developing a large-scale, settled agricultural society across the Mongolian plateau is, for all intents and purposes, impossible. Instead, the vast and wide-open empty steppes covered in grasses are far more ideally suited for herding and ranching livestock.
I wonder how many of these horses have ancestors that were in the Mongol conquest.
Which can more easily move around than settled farms and cities can. Nomadic herders can quickly take their livestock, families, and gurs across the flat steppe to different areas more suited to the seasons.
I mean, this looks like very suitable land.
In the winter, herders will gather their livestock in valleys where the mountains around them protect them from the cold Siberian winds. And then during the summer, they'll relocate to the wide-open, grass-covered steppes to better feed their herds. This is all why, since time immemorial now, for thousands of years, the people of the Mongolian plateau have predominantly always been nomadic
So that's such an interesting thing. Like, they're actually nomadic.
herders, and still to this day, about 65% of Mongolia's
This looks like a wallpaper.
land is used for pasturage and herding animals, and about a third of the population continue to live the nomadic herding lifestyle that all of their ancestors would have found pretty familiar, because it is simply the lifestyle that the unchanging geography and climate forces upon this part of the world. But herding and pastoralism within Mongolia is often a harsh reality. While the winters in Mongolia are usually very cold, but also very clear without any clouds, blizzards and freezing rain are occurrences that can still always happen. When a blizzard sweeping through from Siberia is particularly bad, it can wipe out herders' entire flocks, either by causing them to directly freeze
That looks like Buffalo in New York.
to death, or by covering the grass that they feed upon with a thick layer of frost. During the particularly harsh winter between 2009 and 2010, freak blizzards in Mongolia wiped out more than 8 million of the country's livestock, and many nomadic herders lost everything they had, and were then forced into starting a new life by migrating towards Mongolia's only major urban area, the capital, Ulaanbaatar. Such freak winter storms and associated droughts they can cause on the Mongolian plateau have been further factors pushing the people of the plateau into a nomadic lifestyle for thousands of years. When a storm is bad enough to wipe out huge swaths of grass and kill large numbers of livestock, desperate nomads who lost everything will be forced into traveling somewhere else in search of greener pastures. And the steppes of the Mongolian plateau are really just a part of the greater, nearly continuous Eurasian steppe that spans across nearly the entire Eurasian continent, from Manchuria in the east to Hungary in the west. For thousands of years, nomadic horse societies could rapidly travel across the mostly flat Eurasian steppe like it was the pre-industrial world's superhighway, and a climate-induced disaster in one part of the steppe would then force that area's nomads into traveling somewhere else across or even beyond the steppe. It is for this reason that across human history, the Great Eurasian Steppe became the source of numerous nomadic migrations and invasions from beyond it into the sedentary agricultural societies that developed all around the steppe, like Russia, Europe, the Middle East, and China, who
It's so interesting because we just know there's been so many migrations within the peoples of Eurasia, which is really this entire area. It's a stepping stone in history right here.
variously bore the brunt of nomadic invasions like the Xiongnu, Scythians, and Huns in ancient times, to the later Turks, Mongols, and Manchu. But in modern times, there are many recent man-made problems that have only exacerbated the long-standing climate problems to Mongolia's ability to raise livestock and contain people. Throughout most of the 20th century, Mongolia
What kind of film is
was ruled by an authoritarian communist regime that heavily regulated the size of livestock herds that were allowed in the country, which maintained an element of ecological balance. But after the communist regime suddenly collapsed in the 1990s, the economy
Soviet Union? No, we're not talking about the Soviet Union. I guess we're just gonna have. I guess this is more or less right where the Cold War collapses into the Soviet Union collapsing. We see a lot of Eastern European powers start to break away from the Soviet Union. Is this a similar but not direct correlation to that?
became rapidly deregulated and a capitalist open market economy quickly took over in its place. This simultaneously happened just as the global demand for
That's a
cashmere
flip.
wool in the fashion industry began really taking off in the 1990s. Today, the global cashmere industry is a multi-billion-dollar business,
Cashmere.
and seeking to get in on the lucrative trend, many Mongolian herders recently freed from the legal regulations of the communist era began switching from traditional sheep herds to goat herds that actually produce cashmere wool. And over time, Mongolia would rise to become the second largest producer of cashmere fibers in the world, providing around 40%
Who's first?
of the
China?
entire global supply today. But doing so also came at a steep
China.
ecological cost. Goats, you see, are much worse for the steppe environment of Mongolia than sheep are, because
Because they're eating the grass?
goats will more severely damage the grasses that they feed on. Goats will nibble at the roots of grasses while they eat, which prevents them from being able to grow back, while their
Damn it,
sharper
goats.
hooves in relation to sheep will further damage the upper layers of the soil, which will then
Get some crop planes and just go back and forth. You're good. You're set.
be blown away by the omnipresent winds of the steppe. This phenomenon is leading to overall greater instances of dust storms, air pollution, and droughts across the country, which is making herding even more challenging than it was before. This, combined with the effects of global climate change, mean that the inhospitable Gobi Desert is steadily expanding northwards deeper into Mongolia at a rate of about 6 to 7 kilometers a year, and
That's pretty bad.
is thus steadily decreasing the amount of land in the country that is available to the nomadic herders. And
Hold on, let's flip back a second. Look at that left-hand side. It's like a valley of mountains. Just, you know, comparatively to like Siberia and Russia to the north and China to the south, Mongolia really did not get a good deal in where they're situated, are they? Besides that little, that little valley, or not valley, I guess you could call it a valley, that little right past the plateau where you see the green right above the word Mongolia there. Besides that, geographically, they're not set in the best spot, are they?
steadily decreasing the amount of land in the country that is available to the nomadic herders. And extreme weather events in the country are growing more common too. Up to the year 2000, there were around 20 extreme weather events like droughts, blizzards, and extreme temperatures that could be expected to take place in Mongolia every year.
I mean, that's a lot of places, though, if you look over the last 100 years.
But since 2000, that number has roughly doubled to an average of more like 40 extreme weather events that can be expected per year. As time goes on in Mongolia, more and more of these extreme weather events in the growing Gobi Desert are forcing ever more of the nomadic herders of the countryside into becoming displaced. Historically, this kind of event would have likely triggered a mass nomadic migration out of the Mongolian plateau that could have taken the form of an unstoppable horse invasion like under Genghis Khan. But in the modern era, it's forcing more.
That's just such an interesting and cool, but also curiosity is just erupting right now. Like, how do these people live? How do these people actually live? And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a curiosity.
More of the nomads from the 99.7% of Mongolia's land to concentrate into the city of Ulaanbaatar that takes up just 0.3% of Mongolia's land. A phenomenon that can be clearly seen around the city
Well, they got trains.
today in the suburbs built out of traditional nomadic Mongolian gur tents. But in addition to increasing the frequency of extreme weather events and growing the Gobi Desert, climate change is negatively affecting Mongolia's ability to develop in other ways too. Chief among these ways are the many problems posed to Mongolia and its ability to develop by the layers of permafrost just beneath the country's surface. You see, nearly the entirety of modern-day Mongolia is covered by a layer of permafrost,
Which means the ground's frozen.
where the subsurface soil alternates between freezing solid during the cold winters and thawing out during the hot summer. This is one of the most challenging of
It's like a golf course.
all of Earth's environments to actually build anything in, because when permafrost thaws beneath construction projects built atop of it, the soil settles and can become
That's the capital. That's massive, though.
unstable, which can cause the soil to sort of sink and sag, which causes whatever
I'm guessing most of these buildings are apartments.
was built on top of it to become deformed. Building foundations can sink, apartment building walls can crumble, paved roads and airplane runways can develop cracks and become wavy and warped. Pipelines can burst and break apart, all as the soil beneath them thaws and crumbles. And troublingly, Mongolia has been appearing to be growing even warmer than the global average. Since 1940, the average annual temperature in the country has increased by at least 1.8 degrees.
That's a good thing for their situation.
Celsius, which has not only increased the country's already stark aridity, but also further increased the rate of its omnipresent permafrost thawing. This means that without constant and expensive maintenance, the rate of damage to Mongolia's highways, railroads, pipelines,
Wait, why would that be a bad thing?
airports, apartment buildings,
Not that there's things would all collapse, but like getting warmer in a cold area. Why would that be a bad thing?
and other set-in-place infrastructure will suffer from the thawing permafrost is going to increase even further, which
Volatility in the soil? Like what are we talking? Why would it be a bad thing?
just further limits Mongolia's ability to develop itself and house large numbers of people in more urban environments outside of the capital. And then there are multiple exacerbating historical factors stretching back well into the past that have even further negatively impacted Mongolia's modern population. In the early 13th century, Genghis
The 1200s.
Khan united the Mongol tribes, and for generations afterwards, the Mongols and their horses thundered all across and around the Eurasian steppe, conquering everything in their wake. And in so doing, they carved out the largest contiguous land empire ever seen in human history, spanning at its zenith from China and Korea in the east to Iran in the south and to much of Russia, Ukraine, and Poland in the west. But over time from this apex, the empire quickly began steadily splintering into different sections as infighting between the Mongols themselves began to take hold. The Mongol Yuan dynasty would continue ruling over China for nearly another century until 1368, when they were subsequently overthrown by the Han-led Ming dynasty. The Mongols who once ruled China then retreated back towards the Mongolian plateau of their ancestors and formed a rump state known as the Northern Yuan, which largely spanned over the modern-day country of Mongolia, Inner Mongolia that's a part of China today, and parts of southern Siberia that now belong to Russia. By the early 17th century, the Mongol Golden Horde that had ruled over Russia and the Ilkhanate that had ruled over Iran had each long since collapsed, and the Manchu tribes of Manchuria were beginning to consolidate their control.
It's such a cool map, though. It's such a cool map to kind of look at. The Khanate, and there was so many different Khanates. The Kazakh Khanate, you have the Golden Horde. Right here you have the Khanate. Of course, we looked at the Wan. Interesting map. Joseon, what is now Korea. Japan's the same. It's been the same for a long time. Off here.
Over present-day Inner Mongolia from the Northern Yuan. By 1644, the Northern Yuan had splintered into various different independent khanates. The Russian Empire was expanding across Siberia,
and Russia is going to take most of this territory.
And the Manchu launched a full-scale invasion of the Ming dynasty and overthrew them, subsequently leading to the establishment of the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. From there, the Qing initiated a series of further invasions and conquests into what they called Outer Mongolia in 1687, Tibet in 1723, and into modern-day Xinjiang by 1755. But as the largely Han Chinese soldiers began advancing further into the Mongol-ruled lands, a similar process began taking place as between the Europeans and the Native Americans in the New World. The Mongols, similar to many of the Native Americans, had never lived in cramped, sedentary cities with their livestock and were permanently nomadic and on the go across the steppe, meaning that they had never lived with the same kinds of—
That's an insane photo right there. Just really cool build. Like almost like a teepee, but it's natural. A teepee is natural too. Hard to explain. It's like more ornate earth. Really cool.
of disease.
And you can see you have like a ventilation system built in. So intuitive.
That had long plagued the
This is like it could easily be like late 19th century, early 20th century. Probably more or less late 19th century.
Eurasian cities for thousands of years. As such, the urban and settled Han Chinese had developed resistances to diseases like smallpox just like the Europeans had. And so, when the Han Chinese marched deeper into the Mongolian plateau in the later 17th century, they brought smallpox with them that devastated the—
That's such a parallel, what you just said. Brought smallpox to these people just like the Europeans did to the natives in the Americas. Such a weird Weird parallel.
Local nomadic Mongolian populations who lacked any immunities to it, in much the same way that the Europeans brought smallpox to the New World, that devastated the Native American populations. Due to the combination of smallpox, military violence, and deliberate genocide ordered by the Qing Emperor himself in 1755, the Qing
They
dynasty
wanted to wipe the race off from that? Crazy.
dynasty's conquest of the Zhongar Mongols in the 1750s resulted in an estimated 50 to 80% of the Zhongar Mongol
In 2 years?
population getting
years?
completely wiped out, or somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 people. Then, as the Russian Empire continued expanding across Siberia to the north, the Qing grew increasingly worried about the relatively sparsely populated hold
So there's really no like dedicated Mongolia in 1800.
over Inner and Outer Mongolia,
Okay,
and began
there is.
encouraging large-scale resettlements of ethnic Han to the Mongolian plateau in order to reinforce their demographic hold over the area, which had the effects of spreading more settled diseases like smallpox, and also spreading and reinforcing a new religion to the area.
Buddhism?
Tibetan Buddhism. Over a process that lasted for centuries, Tibetan Buddhism began establishing itself as the dominant power on the Mongolian plateau, and largely replaced the secular authority of the previous Khans. The Tibetan Buddhist Church
Khans were secular? Interesting.
eventually came into possession of an estimated 20% of Mongolia's entire wealth. And on the harsh Mongolian steppes where land was largely worthless, it was livestock, horses, and people who were considered to be far more valuable. Many of Mongolia's nomadic herders began dedicating their sons and their families to the various Buddhist monasteries, either out of personal religious conviction or in order to gain the favor of the preeminent legal and economic power of the steppe. By the early 20th century, there were hundreds of Tibetan Buddhist monasteries all across Mongolia,
crazy.
and an
Wow.
estimated 1 in 3
That's-
of all the men
I mean, this is inside the walls of something.
in the country were dedicated Buddhist monks who had sworn themselves to a life of celibacy, forsaking wives and children. That essentially meant that 1 in 3 men in the country had removed themselves from the dating and reproductive pool, placing even
Which really harms the the population growth.
further constraints on the ability of the population to grow. Then, in late 1911, a revolution within the Qing dynasty led to the empire's collapse and the establishment of the Republic of China, or ROC. The Tibetan Buddhist church and clergy in Mongolia seized on the opportunity that the chaos provided by declaring the independence of
That becomes Nepal.
Outer Mongolia as simply Mongolia, which for the next few years would be a theocratic Buddhist state. The Republic of China, insisting that it was the successor to the Qing dynasty, refused to recognize Outer Mongolia's independence, but was sort of forced into accepting it anyway, because by the 1920s, the Soviet Union to the north was getting established and the Soviet Red Army was intervening in Mongolia to keep it independent. The Mongolian communists
Not too far from 1924 into the early 1930s, you're going to start to see the Japanese come in too.
ended up seizing power in 1924, and Mongolia was then transformed into essentially being a communist satellite state of the Soviet Union, out of reach from the Republic of China being able to ever reclaim it. And the new atheist and communist People's Republic of Mongolia set about destroying the feudal Buddhist theocracy that had ruled the country just before it.
Wow.
By the 1940s, virtually
And it's always like that, like the government, and you can see Stalin in the middle right here. I think that's Stalin. Looks like it just by the picture. But it's always the government that comes after the government that's there. It's the government before that's always been the evil one. So weird. It always happens.
every Buddhist monk in the country had either been killed by the communists or had apostatized from their faith. Only 1 monastery in the whole country was allowed to remain open in the capital, and only 100 monks were allowed to maintain it throughout the rest of the
Well, at least they compromised a little bit.
communist era into 1990. The birth rate steadily increased in the country and peaked during the 1970s, when the average Mongolian woman was having 7.3 children.
That's like a little bit equivalent of like the United States in the baby boom area.
But after the Soviet Union began disintegrating in 1990 and the communist regime in Mongolia that the Soviet Union supported subsequently collapsed, Mongolia underwent a similar economic and demographic shock as nearly every other post-Soviet state experienced, and the birth rate plummeted. By 2000, the average Mongolian woman was having 2.1 children, rather than just 7.3 30 years previously.
I think one thing that people need to also understand is birth rates does not always mean good. it can also mean that there is a high infant mortality or a high mortality rate for children under 7 or 5. People have more children for more likely. It's it's a weird parallel, but it's kind of like how fish and frogs, amphibians, they have hundreds or even thousands of eggs, and very small percentage actually make it through childhood. I wonder how much that theory holds up when it comes to like the mortality rates.
And the rate of 2.1 children per woman has remained more or less consistent ever since. Mongolia's low population and empty countryside has made it a susceptible target to its two significantly larger neighbors for hundreds of years now. Today in the 2020s, Mongolia remains a very big but very empty country wedged in between Russia and China, who have each spent much of the past several centuries taking their turns at controlling it. Ever since the Qing Empire's conquest of Outer Mongolia at the end of the 17th century, Mongolia has basically only been truly independent for very brief periods of time. The Qing directly ruled over what they called Outer Mongolia for more than 200 years, and then Mongolia only existed as a truly independent state from 1911 until 1924, when it then became a satellite state of the—
So what is it since 1990? Who owns? Shouldn't it still just be Mongolia that owns their sovereignty now?
the Soviet Union, which then lasted all the way up until 1990. And it's only been since then, just a bit more than 30 years ago, that Mongolia has enjoyed its longest span of true independence in more than 3 centuries. Had Mongolia never became a satellite state of the Soviets in the 1920s, it's highly likely that the People's Republic of China would have invaded it and absorbed it into their communist regime.
Probably, especially since we spoke about earlier that there was a lot of Han natives migrated into it
instead, as they did with Tibet between 1950 and 1951.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I don't know why I said that was Nepal.
The People's Republic of China only recognized Outer Mongolia's independence as Mongolia in 1949, as their victory on the mainland during the Chinese Civil War became imminent. And they really only did so to appease the Soviets, who wanted to—
Honestly, now it's going to be a very controversial conversation I'm about to say right now. But I think the Mongolian people, pride aside, nationalism aside, will probably be better off joining the People's Republic of China. That's very controversial, and I'm going to tell you my two reasons. Why. Reason A, you immediately have economic uplift. You join as a province, a state. I forget what China utilizes as the terminology for that. Ulaanbaatar still is like the capital of said city-state. But the resourcing of China around the natural resources, preserving the Mongolian culture in the state of being a state, but utilizing People's Republic of China for military defense and economic uplift, social uplift, the resource in the roads, the trains, everything that they can be created by the GDP of the Republic of China. And also, you have better opportunity with economic uplift just because you'll have maritime trade opportunities utilizing a trade concept from one of the ports of the LSC to some sort of train system to Ulaanbaatar. Now, this is, like I said, very controversial probably, but I mean, just shooting from the hip.
To maintain Mongolia as their satellite state. The Republic of China, meanwhile, after retreating from the Chinese mainland to Taiwan, never actually recognized Outer Mongolia's independence until all the way up to 2002. Meanwhile, Inner Mongolia was never able to achieve the same kind of independence as Outer Mongolia did, and it has remained a core territory of various Chinese states ever since the Manchu and the Qing first began taking control of it in the early 1600s. Today, Inner Mongolia is an autonomous region of the People's Republic of China, and there are actually more ethnic Mongols who live within Inner Mongolia than in the actual independent state of Mongolia. About 5 million in Inner Mongolia compared to the Mongolian state's 3.3 million. Despite this, however, the 5 million ethnic Mongols of Inner Mongolia are a minority in their own region, because due to centuries of Han Chinese colonialism and settling on the Mongolian plateau from other parts of China, the Han make up about 79% of Inner Mongolia's population today, compared to the Mongols themselves at only 17%. Today, the former Outer Mongolia and present independent state of Mongolia remains a very small nation of only 3.3 million people, wedged in between the giants of Russia, with 146 million people, and China, with more than 1.4 billion people, in a situation that has often been referred to as sharing a den with a bear and a dragon.
And then you have India right there too, but that's not big. It's not such a big influence comparatively.
And then, to make matters even worse, from Mongolia's perspective, they remain extremely reliant on both the bear and the dragon to survive. 98% of Mongolia's oil and gasoline resources are all simply imported.
Well, they're not such a controversial neighbor, are they?
From Russia, while 90% of Mongolia's exports by value are all sent south to China. The overwhelming majority of all of Mongolia's raw cashmere wool and their raw mineral resources like coal, copper, iron, and gold all get delivered to China for further processing in Chinese factories, meaning that Mongolia is overwhelmingly dependent on Russia for their energy needs and overwhelmingly dependent on China for their primary export market. And as the extent of cooperation between China and Russia continues growing, the walls around Mongolia are closing ever further inwards. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the Mongolian
That's Genghis Khan right there.
government has remained officially hesitant to offer up any kind of condemnation or concern. As Europe began ending their imports of Russian oil and gas, Russia has been forced into a position of increasingly shifting their fossil fuel market towards China, which will involve the construction of a brand new natural gas pipeline set to begin construction next year in
It looks like it goes right through Mongolia.
2024. The Power of Siberia 2. Once completed, it will for the first time directly connect the energy-hungry Chinese economy with Russia's enormous natural gas fields in the Yamal Peninsula that were previously fueling the European Union. The most direct path for this new pipeline to take will travel from the Yamal Peninsula across Siberia and across Mongolia towards China's huge urban cities of the North China Plain. Mongolia really had no other choice but to accept that the new pipeline would travel over hundreds of kilometers of their mostly empty territory. It will ultimately help Russia acquire more revenues in the face of severe Western financial sanctions, while providing China with a more direct land route.
And that's BRICS. That's BRICS. I don't know if Mongolia is part of that, but I'm sure they will be very soon.
For their energy needs, giving the Chinese Communist Party more flexibility when dealing with their ultimate foreign policy objective of establishing firm control over Taiwan. You see, the primary issue that the People's Republic of China is concerned about is that if they were to launch an invasion of Taiwan, the United States Navy may intervene against them and decide to blockade the narrow Malacca Strait, through which the People's Republic currently imports some 70% of their petroleum and liquefied natural gas supply, primarily from the oil and gas-rich states of the Persian Gulf.
That's a chokehold right there.
Right now, a successful American naval blockade of Malacca would cripple the Chinese economy and their ability to wage war. But the more that
That's probably why they haven't done it.
China can reduce their dependence on maritime energy imports through this strait by opening up more land-based energy imports, like the pipelines being built directly from Russia to China through Mongolia, the better China will be able to endure a hypothetical American naval blockade, and the better the People's Liberation Army and Navy will be able to perform during an attack on Taiwan. As Russia grows increasingly authoritarian with overt military aggression in Europe, and as China remains very authoritarian itself, with a potential attack on Taiwan looming, for how much longer can Mongolia truly be said to have a completely independent foreign policy from both of them? If they refuse to allow pipelines to be built across their territory from Russia towards China, and refuse to build more railroads exporting their own mineral resources to China, then what would likely happen to them after seeing that the Russians have had no qualms with invading Georgia and Ukraine?
Okay, that's an entirely different thing. That's an entirely different thing. I do not. There's no way they would invade Mongolia. The PRC might. There's no way Russia would do it. That would just be overkill.
And propping up a separatist movement in Moldova and intervening in Syria. And after no
Well, yeah, but that's not related. It's just, I don't want to get into it. I just don't believe that's a viable argument.
that the People's Republic of China likes to see its
And Mongolia has played nice. Like, that's, you know, they've played nice.
Self as the natural successor state to the former Qing Empire. And then Mongolia used to be known as Outer Mongolia, and was directly ruled by the Qing for centuries and for decades longer than even Tibet and Xinjiang were, which the People's Republic had no problem incorporating into their state long ago since they didn't have any protections from the Soviets. Were Mongolia to refuse all cooperation with China and Russia, it is likely that Mongolia's 3.3 million people and its vast, empty lands would simply be taken over by force once again, just as they were more than 300 years ago. And that is why, effectively, Mongolia has no other choice but to tread very lightly in the years ahead, as they continue balancing between the bear to their north and the dragon to their south. Researching
That's it. Right?
this video and sifting through the data.
That's it. Guys, before we jump off, final thoughts. Mongolia is in a interesting but very detrimental position based off of, you know, by the way, learned a little bit more about what I already did not know. But just based off of this, like, I'm going to go with my gut. Like I said earlier, Mongolia should be a state of sovereignty unless they want to upgrade. And I think if they upgrade, that would be joining the PRC. And that's very, very controversial. Especially if you're Mongolian and you're watching, you're probably like, nah, of course not. We're not doing that. But I don't know. I don't know how the feeling is. I don't know what the temperature is over there. But yeah, guys, thank you guys so much for watching. If you want to recommend a video, Also, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you next time. Peace out. Bye-bye.